the economic reality of Canadian defense sovereignty. Welcome back, friends. I'm Richard Wolff. Today, we are going to look at something that is happening right now just to the north of the United States, something quiet, something largely ignored by the mainstream press, but something profoundly important if you want to understand the shifting tectonics of global capitalism and imperial power. We are talking about Canada. We are talking about a decision, a strategic maneuver really orchestrated by Mark Carney and the current Liberal government to fundamentally alter the relationship between the Canadian economy and the American military-industrial complex. Now, on the surface, this is presented to you as defense policy. It is wrapped in the language of security, of sovereignty, of protecting the Arctic. But you and I know, if we look at this through the lens of political economy, through the lens of how capitalism actually functions, we are seeing something else entirely. We are seeing a desperate, necessary attempt by a mid-sized capitalist power to insulate itself from the erratic, predatory nature of its dominant neighbor. We are seeing Canada say explicitly and with billions of dollars on the table that it can no longer afford the cost of relying on the United States. Let us be very clear about what is happening here. For decades, the relationship between Canada and the United States in terms of military procurement has been a relationship of dependency. It has been a relationship where Canada effectively exported its capital, its tax dollars collected from Canadian workers directly into the coffers of American defense contractors. We are talking about a situation where, historically, something like 70 to 75% of Canada's defense capital acquisition budget went south. It went to Lockheed Martin. It went to Boeing. It went to Raytheon. It went to the massive corporate entities that dominate the American economy and, by extension, the American political system. This was the deal. Canada bought protection, it bought interoperability, and in exchange, it hollowed out its own industrial base. It allowed its own capacity to produce, to innovate, to build the machinery of its own defense, to wither on the vine. Why? Because that is the logic of comparative advantage in a capitalist empire. The empire builds the guns, the provinces buy them, but now that logic has broken down, and it has broken down for a very specific reason: the instability of American politics and the aggressive transactional nature of American economic nationalism. Enter Donald Trump, enter the America First doctrine, when you have a hegemon, a dominant power that suddenly decides treaties are optional, that alliances are protection rackets, that trade agreements can be torn up on a whim or subjected to 25% tariffs overnight. The satellite economies like Canada face a crisis, an existential crisis. If you rely on the United States for 75% of your military hardware, and the United States decides to use that leverage to squeeze you on dairy or lumber or auto parts, or simply to demand political fealty, you are trapped. You have no leverage. You are a client state in the most brutal sense of the term. Mark Carney, a man who understands the flow of global capital better than almost anyone, sees this clearly. This is not just about buying jets or ships. This is about economic survival in a world where the free trade consensus is collapsing. And so Canada has announced a pivot, a massive structural pivot. They are flipping the script. Instead of sending 70% of their procurement budget to the US, they are setting a target to spend 70% of it domestically. They want to keep that capital circulating within the Canadian border. They want to take that surplus value extracted from Canadian labor and reinvest it in Canadian labor. They want to rebuild the shipyards in Halifax and Vancouver. They want to stimulate the tech sector in Waterloo and Montreal. They want to create a defense industrial base that is not just a branch plant of American corporations, but a sovereign entity capable of sustaining itself. Now, look at the numbers they are talking about. This is not pocket change. This is the kind of state intervention that neoliberal economists usually tell you is impossible or inefficient. But suddenly, when national survival is at stake, the state finds the money. They are talking about an additional $80 billion in defense spending over the next 5 years. They are talking about a total envelope of roughly $180 billion for procurement and another $290 billion for defense and security infrastructure. Think about that. Nearly $500 billion of economic activity. In a capitalist system, the state is the ultimate consumer. It is the only entity that can create demand on this scale by fiat. And Canada is deciding that this demand, this immense power to shape the economy, will no longer be outsourced to support the profit margins of American shareholders. This is a rejection of the off-the-shelf model. For years, the argument was, why build it in Canada? It's cheaper to buy it from the Americans. They have the economies of scale. They have the assembly lines running. That is the logic of efficiency. But as I have told you many times, capitalist efficiency is a myth. It is efficient only if you ignore the externalities, if you ignore the social costs, if you ignore the vulnerability it creates. It was efficient to gut Canada's manufacturing base until the moment the border closed or the tariffs went up. Then suddenly that efficiency looked like suicide. Mark Carney is articulating a new logic, the logic of value proposition. He is saying that when Canada spends $1 on a tank or a drone, that dollar should do double duty. It should provide security, yes, but it should also provide economic stimulus. It should create jobs. It should build infrastructure. It should generate tax revenue that comes back to the state. If you buy a jet from the U.S., the money leaves, poof, gone. It pays the wages of a worker in Texas. It pays the dividend of an investor in New York. The multiplier effect in the Canadian economy is zero. But if you build that ship in Canada, even if it costs 10% more on the sticker price, the economic reality is fundamentally different. The wages are paid to Canadians who buy groceries in Canada, who pay taxes in Canada. The steel is bought from Canadian mills. The technology is developed in Canadian universities. The value stays home. Carney calls this a 1.4 to 1 multiplier. For every dollar spent, the Canadian economy gets $1.40 back in activity. That is the kind of math that changes the destiny of a nation. It is the difference between being a colony and being a sovereign economy. But let's not be naive. This is still capitalism. This is still a system based on the production of weapons, on the machinery of death and coercion. We must critique that. We must ask why our societies can find hundreds of billions for war machines, but struggle to find pennies for housing or health care. However, within the logic of the system we currently inhabit, this move by Canada is a fascinating rebellion against the American empire. It is a recognition that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. It is a recognition that America first means everyone else last. The strategy is outlined explicitly. Build in Canada first. If you can't build it here, partner with an ally, specifically looking at Europe or other NATO members, to build it together, and only as a last resort, buy it off the shelf from abroad. Do you see the hierarchy there? The U.S., the former default, is now relegated to the last resort category. That is a stinging rebuke. That is a geopolitical divorce proceeding happening in slow motion. Canada is saying, we will not be held hostage by your political dysfunction. They are looking at the chaos in Washington, the threats to NATO, the transactional bullying, and they are insulating themselves. This is what we call industrial policy. For 40 years, since the rise of Reagan and Thatcher, we were told that industrial policy was bad. We were told the government shouldn't pick winners and losers. We were told the market knows best. Well, the market gave Canada a hollowed-out military and a dangerous dependency on a volatile superpower. So now the state is stepping back in. The state is saying, we will direct this investment. We will build this capacity. It is a return to a more managed form of capitalism born out of necessity. It is similar to what we see happening in Europe, where nations are waking up to the fact that they cannot outsource their energy security to Russia or their security architecture to the United States. The irony, of course, is palpable. The United States, under the banner of Making America Great Again, has forced its closest allies to turn away from it. By aggressively pursuing short-term advantages, tariffs, threats, bullying, the U.S. has eroded the long-term structural dominance it enjoyed. Canada is a perfect example. They were the most reliable customer. They were locked in. And now they are planning a future where they don't need America. They are planning a future where they build their own submarines, their own cyber defense systems, their own ammunition. And they are doing it precisely because they read the writing on the wall. They see a declining empire flailing about, lashing out at friends and foes alike, and they are deciding to step out of the blast zone. And consider the scale of the infrastructure investment, $290 billion. This isn't just about factories. This is about the North. This is about the Arctic. As the climate crisis, another failure of capitalism, melts the ice, the Arctic becomes a new frontier for resource extraction and shipping routes. Russia is there. China is interested, and Canada realizes it has neglected this massive territory because it assumed the Americans would patrol it. No more. This spending is about asserting physical control over territory, about building ports, airstrips, housing, telecommunications in the high north. It is a nation-building exercise disguised as a defense budget. The political economy of this is clear. Canada is trying to repatriate its surplus. It is trying to stop the leakage of wealth to the South, and it is doing so by using the one lever the government still firmly controls, the military budget. You can't easily tell a private consumer to buy a Canadian car if the American one is cheaper, but the government can mandate it. The government can say, we are the buyer, and these are our terms. This is the power of the public purse, finally being used to defend the public interest, or at least the national economic interest, rather than the interests of the transnational corporate class that prefers a borderless world for capital, but a walled world for labor. We have to watch this closely, because if Canada succeeds, if they actually manage to shift from 30% domestic procurement to 70%, it will be a signal to the rest of the world. It will be a proof of concept that you can decouple from the American military-industrial complex. It will show that sovereignty isn't just a flag you wave, it is an industrial capacity you must build and maintain. And that terrifies the planners in Washington. They rely on these export markets to subsidize their own massive military costs. If the Allies stop buying, the unit cost for the Pentagon goes up. The whole Ponzi scheme of American military spending gets a little bit wobblier. This is the dialectic of history in motion. The thesis, American hegemony and integrated supply chains. The antithesis, American instability and aggressive nationalism. The synthesis, a new era of regional self-reliance and economic nationalism among the middle powers. Canada is moving. They are moving money, they are moving policy, and they are moving away from from the United States. Mark Carney is the architect, but the forces driving this are much bigger than one man. They are the systemic contradictions of global capitalism tearing apart the old alliances. And let us not forget the workers in all this. For the Canadian working class, this shift offers a glimmer of hope, a promise of stable, high-wage industrial jobs that have been disappearing for decades. But it also ties their livelihoods to the war machine. It binds their prosperity to the production of weapons. This is the tragedy of our current system, that the only time the state seems willing to engage in massive job creation programs is when it involves preparing for war. We should applaud the move toward sovereignty. Yes, we should applaud the rejection of American bullying, but we must also critique a system where economic development is synonymous with defense procurement. So, as we watch these billions flow, as we watch the shipyards in Vancouver expand and the tech hubs in Ontario pivot to military contracts, remember what this represents. It is the sound of the American empire fracturing at the edges. It is the sound of a neighbor realizing that the lock on the front door needs to be changed because the landlord has gone mad. It is a defensive crouch, a strategic retreat into self-reliance, and it is happening right now, whether the newspapers tell you or not. The era of the unguarded border, economically speaking, is over. Canada is building a wall of its own, a wall of contracts, investments, and industrial strategy to keep the chaos of American capitalism at bay. And that, my friends, is a story we need to understand.